Always something I'm forgetting. Got my little remote here. Okay. So we're learning about entrepreneurship and small business ownership, which are not exactly the same thing, but they definitely overlap. So as you might recall, we talked about how there are about 6 million businesses in the United States. The vast majority of those are small or medium-sized businesses, and only 19,000 businesses have more than 500 employees out of 6 million. So that means we've got a lot of small companies and not that many really big companies, right? Which is kind of interesting. We've seen over the last 40 years or so that our middle class has not really been growing with the overall economy. So as a proportion of the overall population, our middle class has been shrinking. It's growing in numbers, but shrinking as a percentage. There are some people that are moving from the middle class up into the wealthier classes, but I think what's much more common is a lot of people are just struggling and going from middle class to lower middle class to maybe even economically challenged. And I think that the difficulty of starting and sustaining a small business might be part of that. A lot of people that go out and try to start businesses, they realize it can be very difficult and it might not even be profitable. So if you are going to start a business, you really want to think carefully, do people really want your product or your service, whatever it is you're offering? Is there truly a demand? And if there is, how do you protect that, right? We talked about how you might use a patent or other intellectual property protections to try to protect your idea. But even in that case, if somebody infringes on your intellectual property, you need to bring a lawsuit, which can be expensive and time-consuming. So that puts small business owners, again, at a disadvantage. Larger companies can come in and just take their ideas sometimes. There's not always much they can do about it. We talked about different types of entrepreneurs and how they differ from small business owners. So let me ask you, what's your understanding? What is the difference between an entrepreneur and somebody that is just a small business owner and not an entrepreneur? How would you define entrepreneur? Lisa?
The thinkers.
Okay, perfect. So the entrepreneur is somebody who's doing something new. I believe it comes from the same root word as enter. They're entering some new challenge. So there's some risk involved if you're doing something new. Whereas a small business owner owns a small business, but is not necessarily trying anything different. They're just owning and operating a business and hopefully making a profit. So there could be overlap, right? You could be both. You could be an entrepreneur and a small business owner. You could also be, well, you could be a serial entrepreneur if you start a series of businesses. And you could be an intrapreneur, and who can explain what is the meaning of that word, intrapreneur? No?
Starting a business inside of a business.
Okay, starting a business inside of a business. Nice, succinct way to put it.
Yes.
You're an employee, but you're being paid to start a business on behalf of your employer.
That's,
We-
that's
Mhm.
mean when you're an entrepreneur, all your ideas is not your patent, it's from the company that you work.
Well, you might have your own ideas that you come
But
up with.
But probably you sign a paper, everything you create when you're working.
Oh,
there,
yes,
they
yes.
will take it.
It's the property of your employer. That's true. Like, I don't know if I brought this up before, but when my kids were little, there were these Bratz dolls that came out that were really popular. They had like large heads, and for some reason they were popular. I don't know why. And I don't know if they're still around. You all know what I'm talking about, Bratz dolls? Okay. All right. So the guy that came up with those worked for Mattel. He worked in the Barbie division of Mattel. He developed these Bratz dolls, and there was a lawsuit where Mattel said, you came up with that idea for these Bratz dolls while you were working for us, while you were using our resources and our talent and our everything that we had at Mattel. So it's really our idea. It belongs to us because you were on our payroll when you came up with this idea. And I don't remember what the outcome was, but that can happen, right? So just because you came up with an idea, well, here's an example. Here's an example. I don't know for sure what the law would be here or what the rules would be here at Hartnell, but when I used to teach for universities that were for-profit universities, where they're trying to make a profit off of their students, places like DeVry University, for example, University of Phoenix. I used to teach for a lot of places like that. And if I were to develop a course for that university where they're paying me to develop that course, I can't go take that same course and offer it at another university. They could then sue me and say, hey, we paid you to develop that, it's our property, right? So the same sort of thing exists. And really across all industries. Okay, we talked about the different factors that might motivate somebody to become an entrepreneur, the different skills and traits that are helpful to be a successful entrepreneur, the importance of not losing sight of the big picture, right? Not getting so caught up in the day-to-day operations of your business that you forget to see what's happening with your competition or see how your customers' tastes are changing. Those long-term aspects of your business, like where are we going? What are our future products? How do we expand? These are really important questions for the people that either own or manage the business. And if they're so involved with taking care of this customer or calling the supplier, they can lose sight of that big picture. And that's really difficult to transition. If you have started a small business and gotten it to be successful, but then you start hiring other people, it's really hard to trust them to take care of those day-to-day operations, right? Because it's kind of your baby, right? So you want to sort of micromanage it sometimes, which is not such a good idea. We talked about how many new businesses fail, especially in the first 5 years. So got to keep that in mind. If you are starting a business, basically the odds are against you. So with that in mind, how can you beat the odds? What can you do? How can you maybe keep your costs down so that you don't run out of money? Or how do you keep your revenues up so that there's enough money coming in? What can you do to avoid getting to a point where you're just not making any money? Which is usually if a business stops, it's because they just didn't have enough money coming in to pay their bills. You can hire people, as I mentioned, as a business grows. You do need to bring in more people, either as employees or independent contractors. But there's a cost involved, right? Especially with employees. They can be pretty expensive. So that makes it really hard to grow unless your product is in such high demand that you've got plenty of money to throw around and hire people, right? But often that's not the case. Then we got to how we define small business. What is the universal definition of small business? Great question. I told you there isn't one, right? usually based on the number of employees, how much revenue or profit the company made, how many different areas it operates in, but there is no universal definition of what is a small business. And we talked about how sometimes people will start a job, start a business because maybe they lost their job, they need some extra income. So when the economy is going down, that's sometimes a motivation for a lot of people to go out and start jobs. But on the other hand, if the economy is going nuts, that can give people more money in their pocket that they could then use to start their own business. And they might see opportunities in that growing economy, right? So I would say economic changes help spur on more entrepreneurship, whether those are positive or negative economic changes. Then I think this is the last slide we got to. I'm not going to go through it, but if you are going to start a business, these would be some things to think about and to address as you're launching the business or before. So what questions or comments are there on this first half of the chapter? All right, well, let's proceed then. So here are a couple examples. Actually, there are quite a few examples, but I'm going to point out two of very young entrepreneurs who had big success. Here we had a 27-year-old. Did I address this on Tuesday? Okay, just making sure. So we had a 27-year-old started this dog sitting and dog walking network called Rover.com. He raised almost $100 million from venture capital investors investing in this website. And the company was valued at $300 million around the time this textbook was first published. That's not bad for 27 years old, right? And who would have thought a dog sitting, dog walking website would attract so much investment capital from venture capitalists? Anybody familiar with that website, Rover.com? You are? So it still exists, and everybody heard of it? Yeah. Okay. Interesting, right? So he was onto something. Here's another example. This 29-year-old entrepreneur started a company to offer drone services to the film industry. Now, right now, a lot of people are out there with drones and have licenses to fly them and use them for photography, but 7 years ago, this would have been, it was still fairly new. There weren't that many people doing it. So he was in the right place at the right time. I think I mentioned the importance of timing on Tuesday for your business, right? Which you can never completely predict. But he was there, able to offer a service that the film industry needed, and had $1 million of revenue in its first year of business. Not bad for a 29-year-old, right? Start a business that has $1 million of sales in its first year. I don't know how much of that was profit, because I don't know what his expenses were, but pretty impressive. So it is possible, again, if you have the right idea, right team, right plan, right time, to have a successful business, sometimes right off the bat. Questions, comments, or does anyone have examples of people who've started a business, either that was successful or not?
I have a friend whose mother started basically to get, it was during COVID to get thrifted clothes and
Okay.
sell for the house.
Okay.
And then she eventually got a shop, and now she sells it for the shop.
Nice. Okay. So she'd buy clothing at thrift stores and then sell them online?
Yeah.
Okay.
They had like a hole or something.
You fix it? Okay, hey, you know, not a bad idea, right? You can get some amazing values at thrift stores, especially if you know what you're looking for. And there might be people willing to pay a lot of money for that item, right? Maybe you pay $10 at the thrift store and you turn around and sell it for 100. Pretty good profit margin, right? Especially if you can get the customer to pay the shipping costs. Not a bad idea. And she made enough money doing that, she was able to open her own storefront, which is not cheap, not easy. So she had a good business model there. Great example. Other examples. Okay, well, business plans. So your assignment, right, that you're working on this week and submitting by Sunday is an outline of a business plan, right? You're doing it in PowerPoint format. You're just giving me bullet points. But a real business plan is not usually in PowerPoint format. It will usually be a document, like a Word document. And it's not unusual for it to be 50 pages or longer. So it's a good thing we're not doing a full-blown business plan, because that would be a lot of work, right? And you'll probably recognize a lot of these components of a business plan from the assignment, because these are, for the most part, the same things that you're being asked to include, like your executive summary. In a normal business plan, it would be no more than 1 page in length. Supposed to be very short, just to give an overview of why this company is a good idea. So that any potential investors, potential creditors could look at that summary and quickly decide if they are interested in this business. And then hopefully they are, right? That's why you really want to be able to sell why this is a good idea in your executive summary. Now, in your case, it's a slide with at least 5 bullet points, right? So it's not a whole lot of information, but in a normal business plan, like I said, it would be up to 1 page in length. Now, you are not required to include a vision statement or a mission statement, but that would be a normal thing to specify. It helps identify what is the purpose of this business and what is it you hope to achieve in the future. Then in a business plan, you'll have an overview of the company that just goes into more detail about this company. So it's kind of like the executive summary, but in more detail. You'll have a section that explains your product or service, a marketing section where you talk about your target market, the 4 Ps. What are your strategies for the 4 Ps? Who remembers the 4 Ps, like what they stand for? Go for it, Aaron.
Product, place, price. Placement.
No, you're close.
People.
Well, you could say people.
Price.
Somebody help them out. What's the other one?
Promotion.
Promotion, you got it. All right. Nice, nicely done. Product, price, place, and promotion, right? And the thing to remember about that is you need a strategy for each of those. And of course, your product needs a price. You have to think about what's the right price, right? Of course, you have a product, but why is that the product you chose? So in your assignment, when we get to the marketing mix slide, on that slide, be sure to specify what is it about this product that's special? Why did I choose the price that I chose? Why did I choose the particular place or distribution channel? And why did I choose that particular promotion strategy? So again, you don't need a lot of detail, but approach it from a strategic perspective. Explain why. A business plan will have a management portion where it talks about the management team. And you could argue that this is the most important part of the business plan. Because if the investors don't have faith in the management team, they're not going to invest. Or if the bank doesn't have faith in the management team, they're not going to make a loan to the company. So you really need to sell who is the management team and what do they bring to the table. In your assignment, you are one of the managers, maybe the only manager. You're welcome to include other people as part of your management team. You definitely need to include yourself, right? Because you're the one who's the entrepreneur in this scenario. So think about what you bring. What talents, skills, abilities do you have that would help make this business successful? And I know that's a lot to ask, because you might not have ever started a business before, might not have a whole lot of career experience, but you do have things to offer. Maybe you're familiar with this industry. Maybe this is a product that you have a lot of experience with, right? Or at least with similar products. Maybe you've taken intro to business and learned some things about business. Whatever you can talk about that would help you be successful as a manager of the business, that's what you want to include in your management plan. Okay? Because you have a whole slide just for, I think it says management team qualifications. Okay, but it's really about you as a manager. There's an operating plan talking about how the business will actually operate. Now, the chapter on operations is next week, but the assignment is due on Sunday.
Yes.
Right? So we haven't covered that chapter yet, but that's okay. All I really am looking for on that slide is think about, is there any equipment you're going to need to run this business? Are you going to need some employees, and how many might you need? So just think about, how am I actually going to operate this business? And address that on that slide. The location analysis slide also relates to chapter 10. So on that one, you really want to think about, where's my business going to be based? And why would that be the right place? So for example, you're going to start a restaurant. You don't want your business to be, 10 miles up the dirt road where nobody goes there, right? You would want it to be in an area where there's a lot of traffic and people can easily get to your restaurant. Now, if your business is going to be operated out of your home and completely done online, then maybe it's okay that it's out in the boonies. Or if your business is going to require manufacturing, then it has to be someplace where that's allowed. Cities don't allow you to just put a factory anywhere, only in certain areas. So these would be the sorts of things to think about in the location slide. Why is that the right place for your business? And then the financial plan, I really am not looking for a lot of detail there. Only 5 bullet points, just like the other slides. But you do want to address how much money you think you would need to start the business, if any. You might be able to start some businesses with no money, but how much do you realistically think you would need to get the business started? Then think about, in the first year, how much revenue do you think the business could bring in from selling? I know it's just an estimate, but really consider how much time you could put into the business. Look at maybe some of the competitors and see, how much money do they tend to bring in a year. Try to come up with the realistic expectation, it's a hard word for me to say, of how much revenue you could bring in from selling your product or service in the first year. But then also, what do you think the costs would be in the first year? And that's a little different from the startup capital. Right? Startup capital is how much you need to get started. That's not necessarily the same as how much cost you'll have in that first year. Okay, so you don't need any detailed financial statements or anything like that. Just think it through and try to come up with some reasonable numbers there. Now, in a real business plan, you're going to have a lot of supporting documentation that you will be including in there, but that's not required for your assignment. So you see, there is a lot of commonality here between what you're doing in this outline and a more detailed business plan. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, Aaron.
Why do like some people say that like business plans are like kind of like
Unnecessary?
bad or like bad or outdated?
Sure, okay, good point. Yeah, some entrepreneurs are not in favor of business plan. And I think they have a valid point, because if you're out there hustling, you're trying to get investors and grow your company, you might not have a lot of time to do the research and the meetings and everything that would go into making a detailed business plan. There's some industries where things change so quickly, people just have to act on their intuition and say, okay, we're gonna stop doing this, we're gonna start doing that. There's an argument you can make there, especially in very fast-paced industries. I would say if you're a serial entrepreneur and you're so good at doing this that you can operate like that, great. I think for most people though, there's so much to consider in running a business. If you haven't really thought through the various aspects, you're likely to make some big mistakes. Right? If you get just one of these things wrong in your business, like your product isn't quite right, or your marketing plan wasn't quite right, or you don't have the right management team, any of those things, just one thing that you get wrong, and your business might not be successful. So from my experience, taking the time to develop a business plan, whether it's a shorter, briefer business plan or a more detailed business plan, either way, taking that time helps make sure you've thought through every aspect of the business and helps prevent some mistakes that you might make. But I could also see that argument. In some cases, maybe it's not necessary, or maybe even takes too much time. Oh, and another thing, I can tell you from my own personal experience, there have been plenty of times when I had some business idea that I thought was a great idea. I'd be like unable to sleep at night because I was so excited about this new business idea I had. And then as I would start to work on a business plan, I would realize, you know what, it's not such a good idea. And I would just crash the idea and not pursue it. And probably that was for the best, right? Because if I had just jumped in and committed time and energy and money, it probably wouldn't have gone anywhere. Now, that doesn't mean every idea should get shot down, right? But I think as you work on your business plan, that becomes more clear. Is this really a good idea that I should pursue? Or is there more complexity, more issues involved with this product than I would have thought? But it's a great question to ask, Aaron. Other comments or questions? Okay, where are we at here? Oops. I'm gonna do that. Tell you what, let's cover 2 more slides and then we'll do the grow activity. Okay, so this slide talks about angel investors. Who can tell me what is an angel investor?
Rich people who want to invest in it.
Rich people who want to invest in your company. It's usually when your company is fairly new and doesn't have a lot of investors, or maybe not any investors. And this rich person comes in, they probably have some business experience. That's probably how they got their money. Maybe not, maybe they inherited the money, but oftentimes they do have some business experience, and they like to find startups that they can put some money into and hopefully make a profit. And they realize they're taking a risk and they might lose their money. But they also realize they might make enough of a profit that it is worth it. It's worth the risk. And they're usually not looking for a super long-term investment, maybe a couple years. They'll put their money into the company. They'll sort of work with the entrepreneur to help give them some guidance. And then hopefully everybody makes some money. And then the angel investor typically cashes out their shares at that point, or walks away with their investment. And if the company wants to keep growing, then it's going to find other types of investors. So angel investors are usually involved pretty early on in the company. I'll give you an example of this. My son is starting a company with some friends. It's an AI, high-tech software sort of thing. The other main person that's helping him with it is a computer programmer. So he does a lot of the technical stuff, and my son's more of the operational logistics part. And they contacted somebody that one of them used to work for. I think it was, well, anyways, doesn't matter. Who has been fairly successful in their career. And that person agreed to put $150,000 into this startup. I don't know if the deal is solid yet. I don't know if it's been finalized, but just the fact that they found an investor, and they just started this startup like a month ago or 2 months ago, pretty recently. And they've already found somebody that said, yeah, I'll throw in $150,000 to your business. Now that's not actually that much money, because you hire 5 programmers, you can burn through that money a couple months. So they'll probably need even more than that. But that's just an example of an angel investor. Right? They come in early on and look for opportunities where they can, hopefully walk away within a year or two and make a pretty good return. Let's say though that you started this business, you're not able to find any investors that want to invest. Investors really are easier to find with technology companies, because those companies can grow so quickly and make so much money if they're successful. It's harder to find investors for non-high-tech companies because they're harder to scale. If you make a physical product, a lot of cost that goes into making that product. But if your product is digital, you can just make copies of it, sell, like if it's software, sell the software, right? You don't have to actually make physical copies. So if you're having trouble finding investors, or you don't want investors, what are your other options to get money to help grow your small business? Especially if it's a new business. Other than investors, where else could you get money? Banks? Okay, exactly, lenders. To borrow money. Now, it's not that easy, because banks are very cautious about lending money to new businesses. They want to see a track record of success. You've been in business for a year or more and have consistent profits. But that it could be one option. You might be able to borrow money, or even from people you know. But that gets kind of risky, because what if your business fails and you can't pay those people back and you still see them at birthday parties and things, right? That's gonna be kind of awkward. What else, other than investors and lenders, where else could you get money?
So
Okay, yeah, you could do some sort of crowdfunding. Some companies do that. Say, hey, we've got this new product idea, you know, put in some money, we'll send you some product once it's ready, or we'll reward you in some way. That can work. You might have your own savings that you can tap into. Some people finance their business on their credit cards, not something I would advise. Because again, if the business fails, now you have a failed business and debt that you have to repay, right? So pretty risky. Okay, one last question here before we do the grow activity. Where do you get ideas for a business? Where does that even come from?
market needs.
Market needs, okay? So if you just recognize that people want a certain product or service that they can't find, like for example, with the thrift store example, right? People want nice clothing that's affordable. If you can find something that somebody wants at a price they can afford, great. Maybe even from your own experience, right? Thinking, gee, I wish there was a product that did X. Well, there are probably other people that would want that as well. Aaron?
Looking at products, like, how can I improve this?
Okay. Looking at what is out there now and thinking, how can I do it better? Or maybe that product is just not available in your area. How could I bring that product here? How could I make it cheaper? You can look at trends. That's why my son and his business partner are jumping on the AI bandwagon. Because everybody's jumping on the AI bandwagon, right? Everybody's saying, hey, there's this great new technology. I mean, AI's been around for a long time, but it's gotten to the point where it's so powerful, it's being used in all kinds of businesses, right? So that creates so much opportunity. If you can find a way to use AI to solve some problem, you might be able to build a business based on that. Okay. Any comments or questions? So let's do the grow activity for the next 10 minutes. Okay, so I've already addressed this first point, I think, how the role of the small business owner changes over time. When you start a business, typically, you don't have a lot of money to work with, and so you kind of have to do everything yourself, or at least the big things. That means you're doing accounting, you're doing human resources, you're doing marketing, you're doing production, or at least you're in charge of all of that. But then if your business is growing and you can get to a point where you can start hiring people as employees or start bringing in independent contractors to do some work for you, then your role changes. And you need to train them on what to do, but then you need to trust them to do it, right? So that you don't get lost in the weeds. You can let them take care of those daily tasks and you can focus on the big picture. So your role changes from one of being really doing everything to really one where you're more focused on the strategy and not the daily operations. And that's a difficult transition. A lot of people, I'll give you an example. My dad, when he lived up in Santa Cruz for decades and decades, at one point he started a plumbing company. And of all the companies he has started in his life, that was the most profitable one. Because plumbers can charge lots of money. And everybody at some point is a plumber, right? It's just the way it is. And he lived up in Bonnie Doon. I don't know if you know where that is, but it's up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. A lot of rich people live up there. Because maybe they're investors or they work in San Jose and they commute over Highway 17 to Bonnie Doon so they can live up in the redwoods in their big, beautiful mansions that are kind of secluded from the rest of the world. So he was living up there, and somebody would call him in to do some plumbing work, and then they'd say, "Hey, by the way, do you think you could remodel my porch?" And he'd pick up more work than he can handle. So at one point, he decided to hire some people to work for him. Didn't work out for various reasons. So he couldn't really grow his company by hiring people. He didn't feel he could find people with enough talent at what he was willing to pay. Or if they had the right talent, they didn't have the right personality or whatever it was. And he even brought in somebody to kind of eventually take over the business and kind of be a business partner. That didn't really work out either. So he ended up just working on his own, and he was okay with that. And here, he was in his late 70s, picking up heavy things and crawling under houses. He's now 81 or something. He still does it, and not as much. He kind of slowed down, but he's still crawling under houses. Crazy. But for him, he just couldn't trust people to do the work. Right? Maybe with good reason. Maybe it is hard to find people that will really do a good job. But he just found it easier for himself to just do it himself, and that prevented his business from growing. It was very profitable, but it could have gotten a lot bigger if he'd been able to develop a team and kind of let them handle the day-to-day stuff. So it is a difficult transition. Now, as hard as business can be, right? I think I've made it clear that there are a lot of challenges with entrepreneurship, right? There's a lot of potential growth and opportunity and money, but there are a lot of challenges. Imagine adding to that being international, whether it's exporting products to other countries, importing your products from other countries, having operations in multiple countries. You're now adding time zone differences. You're adding language differences, different laws and taxes, different cultures and ethics. It gets a lot more complicated, right? On the other hand, there might be opportunities. Maybe you find some amazing, well, I'll give you an example. I know of somebody in Guatemala. He grew up in Guatemala, but his parents were American and had moved down there. So I think he's probably an American citizen and a Guatemalan citizen. But his business, how he supported his entire family, was buying locally made crafts, locally made products, and then selling them to tourists, and even selling them by exporting them up to the United States. He's made an entire business out of that because here's products that people want, right? And he was able to fill that need. And his clients are not Guatemalans. They're people either visiting or in the US who want to buy products. So there might be international opportunities that you can pursue for your small business, right? That might be the key to your success, but it does bring its own challenges. So from what you know about small businesses, what would you say are the advantages and the disadvantages of a small business compared to big businesses? Like we talked about franchises before, right? So let's say you wanted to open a restaurant. if you start a franchise, right? So you become a franchisee and you open up, let's say, I don't know, a Wendy's. Well, you've got a big business that you're working with. That comes certain advantages. But if you start your own business from scratch, obviously you have some disadvantages, right? What would be some of those disadvantages of a small independent business?
Capital.
Okay, Jim?
Well, you gotta do everything yourself.
Got to do everything yourself, right? Because you probably don't have the money or the expertise to bring in a team to do it for you. I heard capital over here. You might not have the money, right? To open a large place or have all the ingredients you want, have all the staff you want. What would be some other disadvantages of being a small business? Eric?
They're vulnerable to economic downturn.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Oftentimes they don't have huge profit margins. And so even if your business is successful initially, something changes and it can be hard to sustain the business. My dad's a good example of that as well. Back in the 80s, he opened a gym in Watsonville and it was doing well. And then there was a major strike. A lot of I think it was the United Farm Workers, but I'm not sure. But anyways, there was a large local strike and a lot of his customers were on strike and had to cut back because they weren't getting income from their employers. What did they cut back? Their gym membership, right? So even though he had a business that was successful, when there was an economic downturn locally, he had to close the gym. He couldn't sustain it. So very true. What would be some of the advantages of being a small business compared to a big business? Okay, you have more control, right? You call the shots. You're the only owner or you have a small group of investors. More control. What else?
You gain the support of the community.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Communities like to support small businesses because they realize that the profits from the small business tend to get spent back in the community, right? If you open up a Wendy's, yeah, you're gonna make some profit from that, but so is Wendy's. And where are they based? Who knows, right? That's gonna go to investors all around the country, and some of that money, some of that profit leaves the community. So yeah, it is a good idea to promote small businesses. What else comes to mind? What other advantages might there be? One way I like to think about it, you know those big cargo ships that have containers stacked up with like thousands of these containers? Sometimes you can see those ships out on the ocean. Those things are huge. They're like floating cities almost. And it's very difficult for them to make rapid changes, right? When you have a ship that big, even to slow down, it's really difficult because they've got so much weight and momentum. Whereas a little speedboat can kind of jump over the waves and maneuver really quickly. So you might think about small businesses and big businesses like that. Large corporation, you know, can be difficult to change quickly. They might not be able to react. Like think about Blockbuster when Netflix came along and Blockbuster was too slow to move into streaming. Where's Blockbuster now? They went out of business, right? Netflix is still there because Blockbuster chose not to transition. And even when they finally changed their mind and said, we are going to transition, it was too late. They couldn't turn the ship fast, right? But if you're a small little company, it's a lot easier to say, you know what, this isn't working, let's make a change. And you can pivot. In fact, that's the word that they use often in startups. Like, I don't know if I've mentioned this, Sure, you've heard of Airbnb, right? Very popular business, very successful. The guys that started Airbnb, before they launched Airbnb, they were gonna start a breakfast cereal. You know that? They were going to call it Obama O's. It never took off. And they pivoted. They said, you know what? Maybe that's not such a good idea. Let's come up with this new idea where people could rent out their room or their place through our website. And that took off, right? So small businesses can pivot. They can often, interact more closely with their customers so they have a better understanding of what the customer really wants and needs, as opposed to big companies, right? Where you, as a customer, you don't really feel like you're getting that attention. Just like a number, right? Whereas with a small company, like Cheers, right? You want to go where everybody knows your name. I don't know if you know that show. So as a small business, you can provide that personalized service and you build a relationship with your customers. Big businesses have difficulty with that. Okay, so what else? Small business administration, we talked about a little bit earlier during the GROW activity. This is a part of our federal government whose task is to help small businesses. Now, why do you think the federal government of the United States would create a whole agency just for helping small businesses? Why would that be in the interest of the country as a whole? Taxes? Is that what you said? Okay. If there are more small businesses and they're making profits, they're paying taxes. And if they're creating jobs for people, those employees are paying taxes. Valentina? For the stock market.
Increase the GDP.
What's that?
All the small businesses increase the GDP.
GDP, gross domestic product. Exactly, if you're producing more, that increases your GDP. Yeah, okay, let's think about that. The impact on the stock market. So the stock market is publicly traded corporations, right? And some of those could be small businesses. A lot of times they're more medium to large businesses. But let's think about the role of small businesses in the overall economy. If you have more businesses in the economy, like more new businesses being created, that's more competition. And that forces companies to say, oh, here's this new company competing with us. We need to lower our prices, or we need to provide better service and better products so we can stay competitive. So competition in general is good for the economy. And when the economy does well, typically the stock markets do well. So I could definitely see that connection. What else? How else could small businesses help the U.S. economy overall? Cover jobs, taxes, innovation. There's no one. Right? Because if you're starting a small business, it's because you're doing something that somebody else is not doing. God bless you. You're doing it either better, your product is better, cheaper, you're delivering it faster, you're offering it in locations where other people aren't, right? There's something different that your business is doing. So the more we have small businesses out there, the more innovation there is in the country. So how does the SBA help companies do that? They can back loans. So let me explain how that works. If you go to a bank and ask for a business loan, first of all, they probably won't give you one. It's hard to get a business loan, especially for a brand new business. If you've been in business for a couple years and you've got a good track record of profits, and you just need some money to expand your business, then you're in a better position to borrow from a bank. But either way, when they consider whether or not they're going to lend money to you, they have programs where the Small Business Administration will back the loan. What that means is that when the bank gives you the loan, if you don't pay it back, the Small Business Administration will. So the bank is then more comfortable making that loan. Because if your business fails, they know they'll get paid by the SBA. And not only are they more likely to give a loan in that case, they might give you a better interest rate than they would otherwise. Okay? So that can help. SBA loans can be helpful. Again, it's not the SBA that's giving you the loan, they just back it. What else does the SBA do? They have retired executives that can provide free consulting services. They do that through small business development centers. We actually have one in Salinas. So if you have a small business or you know somebody who does, they can go down to the Small Business Development Center and there are free workshops. They can schedule an appointment for you to get some free consulting. You know, they can do all that just to help you grow your business. Any questions on the SBA? All right. Oh, this is an interesting graphic I found. It shows the growth of women and minority-owned businesses. So from, let's see, this would be around 1980 until about 2010. Look at how much women-owned businesses have grown. I think this is probably nationwide. Can't say for sure, but I don't think it's just California. On the other hand, Hispanic-owned businesses have grown as well, and Black-owned businesses, which I think is good, right? We have a very diverse country. Entrepreneurs should be diverse, right? They should reflect the overall population. Historically, entrepreneurs have primarily been white men, right? Because they have most of the power. But we are seeing gradually that power dynamic shifting. Not only that, if you're trying to get government work, so if you're trying to get any government agency to be your client, maybe the federal government, state government, city, county, they often have programs where they will give a preference to your business if it's woman-owned, minority-owned, maybe veteran-owned. So if you're bidding on a government contract, you fall into one of those categories, and your competitor is bidding on the contract and does not fall into one of those categories, you might get the contract just because of the diversity that you bring, which I think is a good thing. You know, I like the fact that creates opportunities for businesses that have historically been disadvantaged. All right, last slide before our matching activity. I have to remember that clock is not always right. Okay, it is right now. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. I think we've talked about the gig economy before. That's when you work for a company, but you're not an employee, you're an independent contractor. And a lot of employers prefer that because it's cheaper for them. They can hire you as an independent contractor. They don't have to pay as many benefits to you. Actually, they don't have to pay any benefits. So it saves them probably 20% or more just right off the top compared to if you were an employee. But there are laws that regulate it too. So that's why with Uber and Lyft, here in California, it's been tied up in the courts for years about whether Uber and Lyft drivers are employees or independent contractors. Does anybody know where that stands right now? I haven't kept up with it. Okay. But if you are an independent contractor, you're part of what's called the gig economy. You're making money by doing this work, but you're not an employee. It's like you're working a gig. It's going to cost you more in taxes. You don't have the same protections, like there's no workers' compensation in case you get injured. So it's not necessarily in your best interest, but it is something that's been very common. And if you're part of this gig economy, you're a small business owner, whether you realize it or not. Just because now you have to claim that income that you earn as business income on your income taxes. If you don't, you're violating the law. If you've earned more than $600 from any one company, by law, you need to declare it and pay taxes on it. So that makes you a small business owner. And then, as difficult as it can be to grow a small business, it puts a lot of pressure on the entrepreneur, on the business owner, that they might be tempted to bend the law or break the law or do things that are legal but unethical, right? It can put you in a very difficult situation. You're trying to feed your family. Think, oh, maybe I can pay this employee under the table. Maybe I can cheat this customer. They're not going to know. Well, that's not a good business practice, right? You might get away with it, but if your business requires being unethical to be profitable, you probably should revise your business model, because ultimately it'll probably come back to haunt you. All right, so we got 4 minutes left. We have 8 learning objectives here. Starting with number 1, different types of entrepreneurs. Talked about serial entrepreneurs, classic entrepreneurs, and intrapreneurs. Which image would you match with that? No takers on that one? We'll come back. Oh, you got one? Which one?
This one.
I can't see which one. Which one?
Analysis and involved, quality planning tree, security control organized.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Based on the research. Yeah, there's really the one.
This one?
Android.
This
Yeah.
one? Okay. You see a lot of people in different roles. Somebody's a chef, somebody's like a sailor or something. So yeah, these could all be different entrepreneurs. How about characteristics of successful entrepreneurs? It's kind of hard to see. This one has some really interesting information. You might
Yeah.
want to zoom in and take a closer look on your own. You can download the PowerPoint, but it talks about which countries they tend to come from. Most successful entrepreneurs come from the US. Most of them did pretty well in high school, but you've got some that actually did poorly in high school and still were successful entrepreneurs. A lot of them didn't have that much job experience, maybe only 5 to 10 years. A lot of successful entrepreneurs actually are married or even have a child. Kind of interesting. Why would that make you a successful entrepreneur? Maybe because you got to feed your family. I don't know. So you might want to take a closer look at those statistics. How about the impact of small businesses on the US economy? Bottom right. Okay. E-business, sales, ideas, shares of stock, research. Okay. How about first steps if you're going to start a small business? Jose first.
Say the one remote, that's his plan.
Okay. Valentino? Same one? All right. Yeah, definitely having a plan. Even if it's just in your head, but I would say preferably a business plan is a good idea. Challenges of managing a small business. What's a good match? Okay, you're going to say the same thing? All right. So we see somebody like juggling a lot of different tasks. That is what it feels like to be a small business owner. What else do we have? Pros and cons of small business ownership. Okay.
I would say the sign that says, risk and reward.
Okay, exactly. A lot of risks, but a lot of potential reward. How about the small business administration? Okay, yep, small business development centers are where you can go for assistance. And the only image we did not use is these two gentlemen. Anybody recognize either of them? They're both serial entrepreneurs. On the right, we have Sir Richard Branson, started a lot of companies that the first name is Virgin, like Virgin Airways and Virgin Records. And then Pierre Omidyar here started eBay and other companies as well. All right, everybody, good luck on your assignments. Have a good rest of the week. I'll see you on Tuesday.
Actually.